is how do we first establish a transitional government that manages the temporary affairs of the country, which goes without saying. As far as I'm concerned, the contacts we have had with the transition team of President Trump this time, the kind of people that we're dealing with are far more aware and sensitive to the needs and a better understanding of Iran than ever before and where the people stand vis-a-vis the regime and so on. There's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that Russia will resist a change in Iran, and that Putin, in his calculation, as a master strategist, doesn't recognize that long term it is not beneficial for him to have a belligerent state with nuclear capabilities next door for a number of reasons.
What was the state of mind of your father in the final days? Was he expecting it to happen at the end, perhaps like months before, or was it still a bit of a surprise? But what does Trump's presidency mean now? Is there a hope that we can move Russia away from the IRGC? In 1979, the world changed. When the liberal secular society in Iran was taken over by the Islamic occupiers, it didn't just change Iran as a country, but it changed the whole world order. The Islamic Republic became the godfather of terrorism and Islamism all around the world. One man remembers what happened. He was there with his family. The Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, was only 17, 18 when he was forced into exile with his family. When the Shah fell, things changed. Since then, we have seen a number of uprisings in Iran and a number of conversations from the international community. Today, we're joined by the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi to discuss what happened and what could happen next. Well, Your Royal Highness, thank you so much for coming on توسی TV. I believe توسی TV is the only new media outlet you're actually being interviewed on in the UK while you're here. But we actually spoke about 4 or 5 years ago in private. That was just after the latest wave of uprising and protests in Iran that we actually classify here as a cost of living crisis sort of uprising. It wasn't really just about politics anymore. But since then, the last couple of years, it's gone beyond that. And it's now people in Iran are talking about regime change. But before we actually talk about what's going on now, let's take it back to where it started. You were just about 17, 18 when your family was forced into exile. Take us back to that moment and how it felt, and especially knowing that you might not be able to return to your homeland.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to your program. I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk to your viewers. Well, interesting that the way you phrased it, because for me it was right after my high school graduation. Literally the day after my graduation, I was on my way to the United States to go to the the pilot training program in Reserve Force Base in Texas. In fact, I had a 10-day stop in London before moving on. I remember I was a guest of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth stayed at Buckingham Palace with the family, and we moved on. And so it's interesting that part of the beginning of what I didn't know would become an exile went through here, and I ended up in the United States. So basically, this was in late July of 1978. So practically about 5 or 6 months before my parents coming out. At the time I was in Iran, I had yet to witness what my siblings did because they were still there, of a rise in protest and the demonstrations and the chants and slogans against my father and all of that. I was very focused on my training, and I think my parents shielded me a little bit from not being distracted by what's happening in Iran, so I can remain focused on my training. But the media anyway was covering events. There was not a day or a week going by where the cover of Time magazine or Newsweek was a picture of my father being burned on the streets and so on and so forth. So all of that was the backdrop and the tensions and the frenzy. I would actually say some kind of a euphoria that existed at the time. My father and mother exited Iran mid-January of 1979, and that's where it would be the actual rupture at the beginning of, now we are talking about a new regime in place, and exile by default started then. The training of Iranian pilots was threatened to be immediately stopped by the revolutionary regime, because other than me, there were other Iranian pilots training in various U.S. Air Force bases at the time. And one thing that the American side was aware of was that, well, this could affect the finishing of my program. And interesting enough, I was scheduled to finish my training in the summer of 1979. Given the fact that I already had pretty much of pilot training, because I used to fly back in Iran before coming. I was an F5 pilot. I soloed first when I was 16 years old at the time in Iran. And so they knew that, it's not a matter of competence, but making sure that I graduate. So they expedited my training so that I could get my certificate at the end before the cutoff point where the regime was implementing a stoppage of all the training. So I was able to graduate in time, and it was the first time I saw my parents again was in, it was once for a short while in January, right after they had existed in Iran. But as of March of 1979, I rejoined with them. And that's the beginning of all the various exile stops that we had to go through, from Morocco to the Bahamas to Mexico to Panama, and all the way back to ultimately Cairo.
It was a kind of turbulence moment, even on a personal level in terms of the family, apart from the actual country itself. You did mention that when it was happening, in order to keep you from being distracted, they weren't probably telling you everything, because obviously it was happening at the same time. But since then, obviously, you've been told, you've had conversations. What was the state of mind of your father in the final days? Was he expecting it to happen at the end, perhaps like months before, or was it still a bit of a surprise in terms of the Khomeini specifically? Because there were a lot of others who wanted him to go, including the communists and all the others.
And, let me share with you more of it, the human side of it, as opposed to the political, cerebral side of it. It always takes time for something to sink in. The first few months, we were so preoccupied by the tragedy of the first wave of executions by Khomeini of former regime elements, whether in the military or in the civilian sector. The execution of Amir Abbas Hoveyda, for example, or Farrokhroo Parsa, who was our education minister, the first women minister in Iran, and many generals that were executed. We were so preoccupied and traumatized and saddened by all of that we had very little time to think, okay, what about us? What's happening to us? Honestly. And so it was not until later that it began to sink in that, okay, now we are faced with a different set of circumstances. One of the elements that is less often talked about but does remain a factor is my father's illness, and the fact that he knew that he was terminally ill. It was only a matter of time where he would expire. And as his children, the first time we were aware of his illness was when he checked in a hospital in New York for his first operation. This is shortly before the hostages were taken in the American embassy in Tehran. Because it all started in the early 70s, but we didn't even know about that. And some people retrospectively said, well, do you think that if people knew that your father was ill and all that, it would have made a change? I said, I really don't know. I don't want to speculate. There are many ifs and buts, but it's, the saying goes, it's Monday morning quarterbacking, or hindsight is 20/20. But at the time, on the moment, there are many things that you wouldn't be able to quite understand. So keep all of these elements into mind. So the mindset, the realization, and ultimately the evolution of things was not just a shock to us, but frankly, I think was a shock to the nation. Insofar as to even his worst enemies today would say, we even didn't quite know how it's going to turn out to. Because our focus was, the Shah has to go, then we'll see what happens. Without knowing exactly what the alternative is. And as a result, by the time people realized what was the consequences of that, it was by then too late. And for 46 years and counting.
Of course.
We've been entrapped with this regime.
They seem to have been winging it at the beginning, the regime itself, because I don't think they knew exactly what blueprint they wanted. They first allowed the Mujahideen to even be in the elections. They were like, yeah, we'll have this election. Oh no, we're going to kill that president. We don't want that president. We're going to ban. I don't think they had an actual plan, but then obviously they found a way. But
well, they did have one mission.
What?
Exporting an ideology.
Yes.
At the expense of a nation.
Of course, yes. But it kind of takes us to now and everything they've done. And at times it feels like they've been pushing it so much that the new generation of Iranians are so... I hate the word westernized. It's not necessarily that they're westernized. They are so aware of the basic rights that they should have, human rights and everything else. That's the next question is, many Iranians today now chant your father's name and your name at these protests and uprisings. And how does it feel to know that after decades, they see that Iran as a symbol of hope going forward?
Well, I think if to simplify the contrast, is Iran should have been the South Korea of the Middle East today, on the path that it had to modernization, development, and so on and so forth. Instead, we have become North Korea. Is it because the people have changed, or is it because the regime changed? And by the same token, why is regime change necessary?
Yeah.
Because the problem has been the regime all along, not the people.
Yep.
In fact, what we tell the world is, unlike this regime that is totally opposed to the value system of the Western free world, we Iranians aspire to the very same principles of freedom, of democracy, of human rights. The only obstacle between us and the free world is this regime. It is our Berlin Wall that we need to break and breach and go beyond.
Yes.
For a while, people thought that perhaps they can change the nature of the system internally by gradual reforms. That narrative is dead, is gone, is a foregone conclusion. Because even the most radical elements that sided with the regime from the beginning are now on a convergence path with those of us who, from the very beginning, challenged the veracity of having a religious dictatorship as secular Democrats. And in that sense, and if you look at the way Gen Z of Iran today expresses itself, it's not a question of being Western. It's a question of being adhering to the very same values and principles that this regime diametrically opposes.
Yeah, because a lot of people say the reason I said I don't want to use the word Western is because those values, you've actually mentioned this before, even the founding fathers in the United States used the
Thomas
values,
Jefferson,
used values of the Persian Empire.
Cyrus's Declaration of Human Rights is incorporated into the American Constitution.
This is where it takes us to the next point, because a lot of people say, I think they just look at it black and white in terms of the West and East. They say, well, look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Iraq. When the regime falls, vacuum, militant groups. What is the difference between Iran and those places? Because obviously there won't be a vacuum, right?
Well, it's great. It's a great and important question that you ask, because it's important to explain to the whole world that the scenario of change in Iran has no resemblance to poorly managed changes of regime in the other countries in our immediate neighborhood. The best example is Iraq and the Baathification, which has nothing to do with the scenario of change that we prescribe to or suggest to the world to understand. Because we say that unlike Iraq, which was the result of a foreign attack or involved boots on the ground or was financed by taxpayers of a country or the other, in our scenario, we're neither calling for a foreign intervention nor are we calling for foreign resources. We say our army on the ground are the Iranian people. And there are ways to use our own money repurposed to support, let's say, various campaigns of strikes and demonstration in Iran rather than a British or American or French taxpayer, which is where the difference lies. But also because, unlike in the de-Baathification process, where there was not a true exit strategy for the paramilitary forces or military forces, in our case, we do offer a way out. We do offer an exit strategy to minimize the regime's ability to rely at the very end on those forces to repress the people even more. On the contrary, to maximize defection, to minimize that resistance at the very end. Now, how could that happen in the scenario of transition? because regime change is ultimately what is necessary. And that's what the people of Iran are asking for. And part of our exercise is to convince the Western world that for 40 years you attempted appeasement and diplomacy, which has failed, because the premise that you had in mind was a change of behavior, which is impossible given the DNA and nature of the regime. The solution is regime change, but rely on the Iranian people. Where diplomacy fails, don't jump straight to conflict and escalation and military strikes. There is a third way, and that is to empower the people of Iran. They are the agent of change. They are your alternative. And empowerment of the people today is the quickest way to resolve the problem.
Yes, this is where the main point of all these conversations come in, because obviously you're clear, people in Iran are clear, they don't necessarily want American troops to be on the ground or anybody to go liberate the Iranians. And obviously this is where the mainstream media have been asking you the repetitive question, we're not going to do it the same way. The other day say, oh, do you want to be king? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? Public office. We do know that your priority is currently to obviously be the advocate and obviously help with the transition to bring back secularism and democracy back to Iran. And I can personally say that you have become the legitimate and credible, obviously, voice for the people that I think that they were missing for decades. I know you were there, but obviously they had to get their timing ready and everything else there. And I think they were a little bit divided for the past like 30, 40 years. What is your plan? What is your role in this? Do you have like a set of plans?
Well, it's truly, the campaign is a 5-point plan that involves 5 major components. The first one being, how can we strengthen the ability of our fellow compatriots at home in their fight to liberation, which brings in the role, a critical role that the diaspora can play in bringing more attention to the subject of how we can encourage foreign governments to be in support of that campaign by means of not only maintain the pressure on the regime by a policy of maximum pressure, but have parallel to that a policy of maximum support. And the diaspora can play a great role having influence on legislators and decision makers in their respective countries in where the Iranians in England with the British government or in Germany and so on and so forth. Understanding that the path to Iran's salvation and what will happen post-regime collapse, when and how it will happen, the timeline is difficult to predict, but let's say it is inevitable, and we already see signs of defections to be the beginning of the end and so forth, not to mention the fact that the regime is at its weakest now, ever since its inception.
They've lost Syria.
They lost their proxies, they lost Syria, and of course the economic situation is always one of the critical writing factors as to when is it that society finally will set, this is it. So the second aspect is to, again, in terms of calling upon Western governments, particularly the European governments, who I believe are behind the curve as far as where the Iranian people are, and are still in the mindset of status quo negotiation as opposed to let's move to the ultimate solution, to convince them that this is the better approach because that other approach has failed and time is of the essence. Particularly if the argument is, well, is it going to escalate to more conflict? Well, it's precisely for that reason that before we get to that point, we now have a window of opportunity, which is unique, and we should utilize that window of opportunity, not only to avoid an escalation of conflict, but to have a resolution to what is the ultimate solution, which is a change of regime in Iran. And the fourth component of this is that based on that, it will create more division within the regime. It will maximize defections from the regime. And the path to the post-regime collapse during the transition is how do we first establish a transitional government that manages the temporary affairs of the country, which goes without saying, but also to lay the ground for the elections of a constitutional assembly, where if the opposition differs ultimately in the final form, that's the debate that we reserve for that moment. In other words, our duty as Iranian citizens and patriots and Democrats is not to be feeling that we have the mandate to decide for our people, but to make sure that the democratic process takes place, and ultimately it's the ballot box that will decide. The important thing and the basis of this campaign of rallying the troops and orchestrating a coalition of the willing is the fact that it's based on the premise of understanding the minimal requirements of agreeing on certain principles that are, I think, critical in the sense of the national outlook. It's Iran's territorial integrity, the importance of a secular democratic system, meaning the separation of church and state as a prerequisite to democracy, which is non-negotiable.
Yeah.
And of course, human rights, which has to be the basis of all the elements that guarantees people all aspects of citizens' rights, equality, putting an end to any form of discrimination now or in the future. So these are the elements that I think constitutes a very broad base of Iranian Democrats that may be different in ideas. There could be Republicans, there could be monarchists, there could be people on the left, in the center, and the right. But I think that's the basic premise of where we can say this is what is the operating principles that we can work together on, and invite those who are now peeling away from the regime, joining with us from yesteryear's reformists that are now disillusioned and want to work past the regime. And that convergence is critical to, to facilitate that path.
Of course, because you mentioned obviously the role of the international community. We will talk about Europe in a second, but what does Trump's presidency mean now? Because not that, again, we expect the American side to do anything specific in terms of foreign intervention, but it feels like in the air that the atmosphere is changing. We've already seen the relationship between Trump and Israel. The support is there now than it wasn't before. Can we see the same thing when it comes to Iran?
Well, I think if you look at what happened during his first mandate and the maximum pressure exerted then, and what kind of an impact it had on the regime and the consequences of that, proved to be somewhat successful, as opposed to, in contrast, during the Biden administration, an appeasement and releasing of funds to the regime, and as a result, empowering the regime and its proxies rather than weakening them even further. And now, under the second term, resuming that policy of maximum pressure, I think, is necessary. But again, at this time, are we talking about going towards a resolution of the problem by this regime no longer be there, or with the hope yet again to tame them into becoming reasonable and come to some kind of negotiation? That's important. So maximum pressure works, but by itself is not sufficient. As far as we want to see change in Iran happen, that's why we're in for that maximum support aspect. So that's one element that we hope will be added to the equation. As far as I'm concerned, the contacts we have had with the transition team of President Trump this time, the kind of people that we're dealing with are far more aware and sensitive to the needs and a better understanding of Iran than ever before, and where the people stand vis-a-vis the regime and so on. It's a question to see now whether or not they could be in tandem or in coordination with some key countries in the European bloc. I think in the Middle East is more clear, but it depends on clarity of purpose and policy. And we'll have to see how that pans out.
This is where the European side is kind of interesting, because there are slight differences between North America and Europe. The European side, they have their own history as well with Iran, especially France and Britain. It seems like the European side would rather have a weak enemy in Iran than a strong equal partner. That's how it comes across. It seems like they still believe in reformists, for example. Are they naive, or do they just not care, or do they just not want internal political trouble with the political right, political left in each country? It seems like the European side, the European Union mostly, and European countries seems to be a bit of an obstacle when it comes to your movement and the Iranians and everybody else.
I think I'd like to see a strong democracy replace a weak dictatorship. Okay? The whole thing is about democracy at the end. And democracies don't go, first of all, at war with one another. And if you want to have a viable and reliable partner in terms of strategic interest, it's not with weakness that you can bring about stability. It's actually from a position of strength. I mean, the whole reason why peace to strength was the rationale of America through decades. I think that today, imagine if the Cyrus Accords were to take place, that this time Iran is part of that equation of the Abraham Accords as a pivotal element to change the whole scene of the Middle East towards the future, not only to stabilize the region by means of cordial relationship with our neighbors, the Israelis, the Saudis, and others, and immediately that's a game changer in terms of immediate ramification of that, putting an end, in one instance, all the negatives that this regime has been the root cause of, nuclear threat, radicalism, terrorism, and all the other aspects of it will disappear in one shot. You cannot do that without having a strong anchor state to play that role. And I think that's why my rationale is a democratic Iran would be the best strategic ally to bring about that stability and encourage others to follow suit. In fact, when you look at the way the regime had to revert to practically playing into the hands of its alliance with countries that have been in some way perceived as, in the democratic argument, again, I say, the role that Russia has played. Look at what's happening with the Ukraine, what China represents and what it is in terms of impact. And Iranians are outraged of how much concessions by the regime was given over the Caspian Sea, over the leasing of islands in the Persian Gulf, and so on and so forth. That's because they realize that the regime has done that completely under weakness. But has it been in the interest of Iranians, or for that matter, in the interest of the free world? Here's where I would argue that a strong Iran will not let our national interest being stampled, but it will also be protective of something that is important for the world, stability and security, and of course, at the end of the day, healthy economies. That has to be only plausible under stability. And this regime has been the root cause of instability and all the chaos that we see in the world.
This takes us to the infrastructure of the IRGC, the Islamic Republic, which again goes back to oil production and things like that. Obviously, the international community say that they've been sanctioning them, but we can clearly see that the oil revenue and things like that is still a major income for them. Obviously, they use that to help the proxies and obviously not their own people. Do you think the Islamic Republic, do you feel that they are not honest about the true nature of its wealth and its spending? Because there are some obviously dodgy deals with China. They're giving away a chunk of Iran to the Chinese Communist Party. Their relationship with Russia, which again, that hopefully can change as well. Are the European side, the Western side, naive about Iran's same thing that could apply to the nuclear program? Are they naive?
Well, I mean, there are always sometimes things that seems out through the cracks. But in general, the production capacity, the income it generates, how much the sanctions play into reducing the regime's ability to have access to revenue. These are calculations that, of course, economists could answer much better than I can in the sense of the technicalities of it. But in general, I think that what you look at is not only that aspect that the regime could depend on or would not be able to depend on, but there's also the domestic economic state of affairs, the devaluation of our currency, inflation, poverty line, and so many other aspects that irrespective of the regime's revenue, it doesn't trickle down to Iranians anyway. It's just only how much do they have to grease and fuel their own war machine to maintain repression at home and continue their aggression abroad. So that's what needs to be curtailed, hence more maximum pressure, listing the IRGC on the list of terrorist organizations when it comes to Europe and their governments adhering to that, bringing even more sanctions because the regime now is blackmailing Western governments that, okay, we can take some hostages and now you have to play, the game of paying bribes or ransom for hostage taking. And that could be, an escalation of sanctioning their diplomats, expelling them from your countries and so on and so forth. But that's again on the maximum pressure point. And then we have to also address the other aspects.
When we talk about maximum pressure and the relationship between other countries and the IRGC, we talk about Europe a lot and the US. There's also other countries like Russia. Is there a hope that we can move Russia away from the IRGC? Perhaps, they're part of negotiations with the whole Ukraine thing and NATO. Is there a way to kind of fracture that relationship between the Kremlin and the IRGC? So that obviously.
Well, look, there's no question that Russia had a big role to play to maintain a regime in Iran, like the one in Iran, in power, as they did with Bashar al-Assad. However, we did witness the fall of the Bashar regime, and we didn't see much retaliation by Moscow or an attempt to keep it from happening, have we? Which leads me to believe that there's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that Russia will resist a change in Iran. And that Putin, in his calculation, as a master strategist, doesn't recognize that long term, it is not beneficial for him to have a belligerent state with nuclear capabilities next door, for a number of reasons. but what is he trying to get the maximum possible out of this deal? But the determining factor is not going to be Putin in Moscow or Trump in Washington. It's going to be the Iranian people in Iran. That is the determining factor. And that has been the essence of my strategy, not to rely on what Moscow does or what Washington does, but what we can do. And only relying on our own resolve and aspiration, not counting on anything else but ourselves. But what I say to my fellow Iranians as well as the world is, of course, it will be much less painful or difficult for us to achieve that if we had your support. As a matter of fact, when you are under the discipline of orchestrated civil disobedience in a non-violent form, we have seen that without the tacit support of key governments of those movements, whether it was Lech Walesa and Solidarity in Poland, or the ANC and Nelson Mandela to put an end to apartheid, it could not have been reaching its positive conclusion had it not been a clear support. I mean, after all, the Soviet Union collapse was mostly due to a very well orchestrated, coordinated alliance between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that Gorbachev ultimately had to succumb to.
Sure.
If you keep examples of successful campaign without involving foreign intervention or anything like that, it was because ultimately they empowered the dissidents and the activists and the civil society and the leadership in those countries to see that this time you have their back and they are not fighting this fight all alone.
Yes.
And that's really what has been missing all along.
Yes.
So if that shift of strategy and policy was to occur, then I think Iran is much closer to the point of getting rid of this regime, and finally Iranians can breathe that now we can be masters of our own destiny.
Yes, well, I think a lot of people are still becoming more hopeful anyway. Just a couple of final quick questions. Last time you saw Iran, you were a teenager. If you could close your eyes, what's the first thing you see? What do you miss the most about Iran?
Well, I mean, all the images of my childhood, the places that I visited, the interaction I had with my fellow compatriots, many of time in a completely impromptu, unofficial, incognito capacity. Sometimes they knew who I was. Sometimes they even didn't know who I was.
Yes.
It was funny for me when people would say, "You look so much like the Crown Prince." And of course, my entourage will. Many people say that. It was funny. It was it's the sound, it's the smells, it's the views, it's the images and all that. And, that stays with you. It's like almost like, there's a stamp in your brain somehow there. Thanks to social media.
You can see it.
Which did not exist when I was in Cairo.
Oh, that's true.
At the time, I remember the first message I had to send was on a telex machine. With, have the dots. I think if you talk about the telex machine with today, people say, "What the hell are you talking about?" Something you find in a museum, maybe. So it's really an artifact. But it's true. I mean, today I can pick up my smartphone and probably even be able to connect to a satellite to be connected to the world. Today's technology. What I'm trying to say is that the advent of social media made daily communication and interaction with your country so much more vivid and tangible. That's how I communicate, as a matter of fact, with fellow Iranians. They message me on Instagram, on Telegram, on WhatsApp, or what have you. It's a way of remaining connected, and I never felt that because I was forced to live outside of Iran, I had ever left the country, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to say, if you could go back, when you go back, where would be the first place you're going to visit? You're going to go back to the palace, your bedroom, or you're going to go to Shomal somewhere?
My preoccupation has always been, and that's why we have IPP as part of my campaign, which is Iran Prosperity Project.
Yes.
In other words, well after we settle the political change, people have to understand, how does that make them have the ability to put food on the table? Will I have a job? Will I have the ability to, get back in this? What is the immediate impact? And do we have a plan for that? We do have a plan also for Iran's prosperity, short term and long term. Parallel to all these political actions, I've been for a long time talking to entrepreneurs, industries, companies, technologies that will be applicable to the needs our country would have, or in what way can we be region sensitive, what would be the most important immediate relief and impact, economically speaking, to the most disaffected areas in Iran. I'm thinking of Baluchistan as to be the most vivid example of such disparity of wealth and misery that exists. So, that's the first place I would like to go and see what's the lay of the land and in what way can we, sometimes, just to give you an allegorical image, imagine if Elon Musk decides to place a Tesla plant in Baluchistan. I know other resources, but or I really believe that the tourism industry in Iran is huge in terms of revenue for the country, much more than any other country in the region, but we need to have a clean environment. We need to be able to address many other issues and create those opportunities. There's a whole host of elements that a different Iran, accountable, responsible towards the country, invites not only domestic investment but foreign investment to really kickstart our economy. I mean, that's all achievable. It won't be able to happen while this regime is still in place because of this corrupt system with a ruling paramilitary mafia at the head that controls just about everything. But I'm sure there are a lot of Iranian entrepreneurs waiting for that opportunity. And you were talking earlier about the diaspora and how much their role could be in supporting that and that connection and be our ambassadors from the country to the outside world, reconnecting them to Iran. All of these are at play. So it's really a roadmap to recovery as well, both on the political side but also on the economic side, which is really what at the end of the day is people's sense of relief and feeling secure that their children will have a better life.
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps with the success of توسی TV, we could run the state TV afterwards. Thank you very much, Royal Highness.
Thank you for the opportunity again.
Coming on the show. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Good to see you.